All right, let's talk engine gaskets. I have a simple old school trick that'll save you a ton of time, money, and aggravation if you're the kind of guy who regularly digs into your engine. So like, valve lash adjustments or cam timing adjustments, stuff like that. Swapping intake manifolds. And I also have something I want to talk about that you should really never use. I'll get to that last. So the trick. All right, so here's the thing. Engine gaskets are generally intended to be single-use items. So in other words, they expect that you bolt together whatever assembly it is that takes the gasket, then it's it. You're done. You send it down the road. But if you play with hot rods, it's not like that. You're always taking the thing apart. You're always digging in and tinkering and changing things and so on and so forth. So having to replace gaskets every time you want to play with your engine, it can get expensive and time consuming, and you still have to go get this stuff, right? Providing it's even readily available, because a lot of the engines that we screw around with these days, you can't just run to the auto parts store and expect them to have the parts for it, or the gaskets for it on the shelf. So you want to try to preserve them as much as possible. Now, some single-use gaskets should always stay single-use gaskets. Head gaskets are an example of that. Once they're in place, once they're torqued down, they do a specific job and they shouldn't be reused. Unless, of course, it's like a copper gasket and it's supposed to be reused, that's fine. But a normal composite or even MLS gasket, once you're done with that, once it's been torqued in place, you really should consider it to be a throwaway. But water pump housing gaskets, timing chain cover gaskets, valve cover gaskets, intake manifold gaskets, those are all subject to be disturbed when you're playing with a hot rod engine. So the problem now is that the gaskets, the stock gaskets, will generally try to adhere to both surfaces. So let's just say this water pump housing, they'll want to stick, after it's been through a couple of heating and cooling cycles, they'll want to stick not only to the water pump housing, but also to the block. So even if you don't put any sealer or glue on these, when you go to take it apart, they're going to separate. Now you have to scrape it off and start all over again, unless you know the little trick. So this involves 3M weather stripping adhesive, the yellow weather stripping adhesive, not the black. The black is okay, but the black isn't nearly as durable as the yellow. And baby powder, or any kind of talcum powder. So all you want to do with this is, obviously, the surface has got to be clean, you know, all the old oils and everything, clean and dry. So all you want to do with this is just spread. This stuff is very snotty. Takes a little while to get used to working with it. You just want to spread it out over the surface nice and evenly. You don't want to glop it out like it's silicone. Just a nice even film of it. Drop your gasket in place. Now the first time you put the gasket in place, set it, right? Tap it down a little bit and then peel it up. Because you want it to tack. You want to see those strings. Then that's it. She's done. Now you let that set for about 10 or 15 minutes. It won't cure completely. It doesn't cure completely for about 24 hours, but it'll tack in place so that it's more or less permanent after just a few minutes, 10 minutes or so. So once you got that all done, baby powder. You just give it a sprinkling of baby powder, spread it around, and you're done. So now the gasket is permanently attached to the water pump housing, so it can't be pushed out through pressure or movement or anything like that, but it also doesn't have any way to stick to the engine block or whatever it's being bolted to, because the baby powder, the talcum powder, will keep that bond from happening. You can reuse these gaskets over and over and over again. Back when I was messing around with the fuel cars, you could literally get an entire season out of a set of valve cover gaskets because, and the gaskets come off 3 times every time the car is run. And a cold lash, warm the motor up, hot lash, and after the run, you pop the valve covers off and you go through it all. So it's like 3 times on and off for every run, and you can get a whole season out of one assembled valve cover and gasket using this exact method. So, and that works on paper, cork, and rubber gaskets. So Simple, right? Good stuff. All right, now let's talk about these things. These universal exhaust manifold gaskets, not to be confused with a header gasket. These are universal exhaust manifold gaskets, and you'll find them in countless different headsets and overhaul engine gasket sets. And I say they're universal, yes, they're going to have different ports and different bolt patterns depending on the application, but they're universal in that they all have this silver front and like a paper back, okay? So much may make a simple topic very complicated, but nothing is ever as it seems when you're dealing with engines, okay? So here's what you need to know about this. Different cylinder head exhaust manifold combinations have different expansion and contraction characteristics. So for instance, an aluminum head with a individual runner exhaust manifold, cast iron, is going to have a different expansion and contraction profile than, let's say, a log manifold with an iron cylinder head. So you'll notice that there are many different methods. The factory, the engineers, choose many different methods to seal the cylinder head to the exhaust manifold, but none of them include anything that even resembles this. So you'll find, depending on the application, you'll find like copper gaskets, or you'll find embossed stainless gaskets, or you'll find just steel shim gaskets. And in some cases, and in most of the popular engines that we deal with as hot rodders, no gaskets at all. The manifold bolts directly to the cylinder head. Chevys are like that. A lot of the Mopars are like that. Some of them use a steel shim. So why do they include these if they're not like application specific? Well, okay, these are kind of like a Band-Aid, and they will work as a Band-Aid for a period of time. So if you're assembling an exhaust manifold to a cylinder head, regardless of configuration, and there's some warpage or some pitting, unevenness to the exhaust manifold, these will take up the slack, and they will temporarily quiet them down. So you'll get 3,000, 5,000, sometimes 10,000 miles out of them. They will blow. They almost always eventually are blown by about 10,000 miles. And it's almost always in the middle ports, and it's almost always at the bottom. I've seen them go in all different ways. So here's what you need to know about this. Only use the type of exhaust manifold gasket that the manufacturer originally designed for that combination. And if no gasket was used at all, like I said, small block Chevy is a perfect example of that, don't ever use these. And the reason for that is because, remember, the cylinder head and the exhaust manifold expand and contract at different rates. The cylinder head is still cold to the touch when the exhaust manifold is hot. So it expands a lot before the cylinder head gets a chance to catch up. So those surfaces are always rubbing against each other slightly when the engine is running. The cylinder head is cooled through the engine's cooling system. It maintains a fairly stable temperature. The exhaust manifold, its temperature is always rising and lowering depending on the load. It has no independent cooling system, so it always runs hotter than the cylinder head. And then when they cool down, they both go to room temperature. So different expansion and contraction rates. So when they design these engines, when they design the system, the exhaust manifold to the cylinder head, the engineers take all of these things into account, and they choose the type of material, the type of gasket that will work best in that situation. Or, very, very important, no gasket at all. So if your engine has a steel shim, just a plain steel shim, or it is bolted directly to the cylinder head, don't ever use these. Just forget the Band-Aid part of it. If you have an exhaust leak, or you can see that there's pitting or warpage on the exhaust manifold, take the manifold to a machine shop, have it surfaced, and then bolt it together either with a steel shim or without. If your engine happens to have like some sort of embossed gasket or a copper gasket, only use those. These things are a Band-Aid, and that's all they're good for. It says you'll never find this design in nature. This is only an aftermarket thing, and it's really only intended to be used as a Band-Aid. I don't know why they do that. I don't know why they do that. And I've seen people use these really, I should know better, but no, there they are. And always 10,000 miles down the road, and it's leaking. So, all right, that's it. So hopefully we save you some money and we save you some aggravation, and I hope you got something out of that. And I'll see you tomorrow.